Welcome everyone, it's Haz here, and today I can finally bring my final review of Sea of Stars after 100% completing the game with all achievements and side content, and now be absolutely sure that I've done everything possible so that we can treat the game with the utmost respect it deserves. Sea of Stars is a brand new retro-inspired JRPG by Saboteur Studios, following the footsteps of games such as Mario RPG, Breath of Fire, or even Chrono Trigger, and since release the news of Sea of Stars is spreading like wildfire on being the spiritual successor of Chrono Trigger and possibly being the JRPG of the year, and while I do agree that it is an exceptional and very interesting journey, it unfortunately also falls short in some aspects that keep it away from being the unforgettable experience like the previously mentioned titles. But without further ado, let's get into it and try to talk about everything. Starting with the story of Sea of Stars, it is going to be one of the major controversial points for most people, and while some parts of that will be up to subjective preference to storytelling styles, it also has some flaws that I think are objectively frustrating and might have been unfinished threads of development due to studio limitations, but that's merely a guess. Starting with the positives, if you like wholesome and friendship-based stories, then Sea of Stars will not disappoint you. In a sense, the whole story revolves around friendship as a meta theme, almost to a fault, that if an overly optimistic vibe can bother you, then it can get irritating. Otherwise, it's just a very pleasant experience with really upbeat moments or depressive scenes that we might be familiar with from personal experiences from our lives, and so the storytelling style heavily relies on empathy of the player to share the emotions of the characters. Apart from the slow beginning, I've also found the pacing of the story really good. It never ended in 30 minutes of just dialogue and lore bomb at any point in the game, and the balance between story and gameplay was close to perfect for my own style, which I find very important as too long dialogue sequences can break my immersion, even if it's really interesting. But in Sea of Stars' case, it might also have come at the cost of story and character depth, as there are just not enough lines to get to know the characters well and really get attached to them. So if you're a fan of deeper stories, this can feel shallow for some, as it tries to remain a lighthearted story. The story itself does not start as anything special, and I might even say that doesn't change later either. It's the storytelling itself that's very entertaining, as the game has multiple quality plot twists, not the forced ones, that really keep you on your toes guessing, or make you jump up in your chair, and while it might not be as well written a JRPG story like, let's say, Chrono Trigger, or a newer serious title like Triangle Strategy, the way the story is being told makes up for it and keeps it memorable. It's about two young Solstice warriors, Zale and Valere, who set out on a journey to defeat an ancient evil of the world that their ancestors failed to defeat, and the way I would describe Sea of Stars is similar to some other RPGs, where a great bulk of the story has practically already happened, and you as the protagonist is there to explore and learn about the past and its effects on the present, while finishing what needs to be done in the end, accompanied by several other party members with their own backstory and drive. But the main journey is about learning what happened with them and the world, and what the lore is through quests and short stories like the villain of the story, the Fleshmancer. I personally like this kind of storytelling, and the world building is the strong part of Sea of Stars. It has a brilliant world lore and past characters and mysteries, but due to the shortness of the game and the steady pace of the game, by the time you finish, you notice there are just too many plot holes and unfinished storylines for major characters and events, and if you're invested in the world after all the excellent lore you can find, this is going to be a major disappointment, as there are just no answers to your questions. You get to see and interact with most of the past lore you hear about, which is exciting, but only so much that they all feel like teasers and not full stories. For instance, one of the main criticisms for the writing and the story is that the main characters are extremely bland without personality. And I agree with that statement, but not because the writing or the characters are bad. But there is in fact a huge reasoning for the Solstice warriors to feel lonely. It's actually a huge plot point. But like I just said, either due to development time constraints or a design choice, it never gets explored, as the game tells its story only on a surface level. There are main characters to the story who just disappear halfway into the plot, or interesting legends and mysteries as side quests don't get a closure for their stories, which is very frustrating since they are the most interesting part of the story, and in a sense, in Sea of Stars, there isn't side content. Almost everything is perfectly tied together for one big story of the whole world, and you pretty much have to complete everything for a final ending, and so you will inevitably experience this frustration if you truly wish to finish the game. After 100% completion, I love the world of Sea of Stars. I really love the grand story and lore of what was happening, but now I also feel I was hooked into something that never delivered a satisfying conclusion to most of its plot points, and I want whole expansions that could be added to finish the story, and even a prequel after where we could fully experience everything that happened and we hear about in the game but never gets fully explained. So how much you will enjoy the story of Sea of Stars also greatly depends on how determined you are to know every bit of the lore. Or can you let things go and just enjoy a surface level of storytelling about an incredibly fascinating world that there's just not enough time present in the game to fully understand and explore? Now, I think combat is one of the major points where Sea of Stars really excels at, and while once again it isn't perfect, I think it accomplishes the goal it sets for itself and manages to stay exciting and fun throughout the game, and I might even say it reaches a close maximum potential it can be. I also want to combine combat and progression into a single section, since there isn't much free progression in the game, and it's mostly tied to combat. Combat is standard turn-based JRPG with a twist that control over your party is shared, and once it's your turn, you can freely switch between your characters to determine the order of your actions. And you can even switch between active and backup characters not on the battlefield as you will, so you always have 5 characters at the end ready to do whichever action you choose and make the right decisions. This is a vital point in the combat system, as the unique pacing of Sea of Stars revolves around a so-called lock system, where each time your opponents try to use an ability or cast a spell, a combination of existing attack types and elements will appear above them, and like a puzzle, your party can attempt to break these locks with the right attacks and combos before you run out of time. And you can either partially weaken the incoming attack or completely interrupt it to avoid getting attacked, but also to win a free turn. These combinations can be anything from a simple bludgeoning and slashing damage that you can use a combo for with your protagonists to easily shatter the lock, or complex puzzles where you quite literally have to use all 5 members of your party to properly shatter with the right order. To be able to fully counter most locks, Sea of Stars also requires a careful planning and saving of your various resources like mana, combo points, and your ultimate charges, as if you are out of one of these at the bad time, you can completely miss breaking a whole lock and get punished by a very powerful boss ability, but thankfully, all your actions are in synergy with each other, and your normal attacks can usually also be used to break locks through the use of a so-called living mana system that combines magic with normal attacks and also restores your MP. The system itself is incredibly fun, and if you like puzzles, that is exactly what these locks are, a constant puzzle minigame of remembering all your actions and then executing them in the right order for a rewarding outcome. But this system unfortunately also has its faults, as I found it isn't always possible to break the locks, and sometimes they even rely on resources or mechanics that you simply don't have available, and as satisfying as they can be when they work, when you get an unsolvable puzzle, I think it's equally frustrating to be forced to let it go, even though you do understand it's part of the difficulty, but still the sense of not being able to solve a puzzle scratches at the back of your mind. Now, this combat system is further enhanced by various side features that support it, from a character combo system similar to Chrono Trigger, where multiple characters can combine their moves into special attacks, ultimate attacks for each of your party members, and also a very unique interactive skill enhancing feature that lets you smash your button or carefully time a button press to enhance your attacks, healing, or blocks, and as far as I could tell, every single move in the game has a timing to enhance or give them a bonus effect, which is really fascinating and fun to explore, and is probably one of the greatest challenges of the game to fully master it. The easiest example to this system to showcase is the Boomerang of Valere, that once you cast, you can time to bounce your boomerang back at your enemies each time it returns, and you can potentially bounce it over 25 times for increased damage, but also more elemental effects on them, as each bounce will count as moon damage, so you can break multiple moon locks on enemies in order to interrupt them. It is a really fun interaction if you don't mind quick time events, but like I said in my early impressions of the game, this can be a problem for those who don't like or aren't as good at these mechanics, as despite the game telling it isn't necessary, it is a major point in order to fully enjoy the combat, and on top of that, the timings are never really explained in the game either, so finding out that you can time every single spell, even heals, and then finding the right millisecond to press that button can be frustrating to explore on your own. So as you can hopefully see now, the whole lock system relies around using these interactions to potentially overpower your spells for multiple log breaks, using the right characters through switching, and then also saving up mana and combo points to be able to use them at the right time. And I really think the game reaches its maximum potential to a point but there is only so much you can mix and match with this lock system before it would get too repetitive or straight up silly, and just like the system itself is unique, it's equally limited by the same uniqueness. Where the combat system I think offers a bit less is further meta systems like protection, buffs, and debuffs that are main parts of this genre, and I would say this part is subjective since not every game has to be ultra complex with all these different effects. It certainly makes the system itself a bit more shallow for those who are looking for a grander RPG system, and also definitely reduces the replayability of Sea of Stars since there's just nothing to play around with, so all your playthroughs will pretty much be the same. After all of the basics of combat, we can finally talk about progression, and a lot of the criticism of Sea of Stars are about this progression system, or mostly the lack of it. In Sea of Stars, you will overall have 6 party members available, with each of them having 3 abilities and an ultimate they can use that you cannot expand further, and they will have their own weapon, armor, and 3 accessories they can equip. Leveling while present in the game isn't something you have to focus on, and the traditional JRPG grind is pretty much eliminated by careful pacing of the game that you seem to always get just enough experience to keep on your proper level. And while you can choose certain attributes on each of your level ups, I found that you will just want to choose health or mana each time for the best results, and these bonuses aren't as rewarding or game-changing overall, so you're pretty much just stuck with the characters and spells you're given. Like I mentioned earlier, the lock system, while being very unique, it is limited by options before it gets overly complicated, and so there are only so many combinations you can add into the game to keep it entertaining, and it is directly reflected by the very limited spell options for your characters. You just basically don't need more of them, since the ones you have can already be combined in various ways to break the existing locks, and sure, there might be more combinations, but once again, you have to consider if it's actually a good idea or not to add more. Instead, one of the more interesting ways to progress is to explore your maps carefully and gather the character combos that you can unleash in combat for combining the different attack types and elements of your party members. These are basically the new spells you can unlock in the game, and some of them are really useful and valuable, so they certainly make the lock system a bit more interesting, even though you can't really spam combos sadly. Unfortunately, the itemization is mostly just there for show on the other hand. The weapons and accessories you can get in the game are all almost unavoidable, and you will pretty much gather most of them without an issue, and they are more of a story reward and natural leveling up of characters than something you can play with. Most of these accessories just give you a bit more health, a bit more damage, or other useful gameplay options that you won't really unequip at all because they are so useful. But the number of accessories are so few that there's just no room to play with them anyway, so you'll pretty much have them all equipped by the end. Instead of all of this, the main progression of Sea of Stars seems to revolve mostly around unlocking your new party members and their associated spells, as you steadily unlock new members who join you throughout the game's story, and learning to properly time and utilize their spells is actually one of the major challenges of the game, and it is quite an interesting design that most of your gameplay progression is centered around unlocking new characters rather than anything else you could find, buy, or customize. In fact, I think this is also a great example of the excellent pacing of Sea of Stars that just by the time you would get bored of your current limited spells and abilities and the lock combinations the enemies throw at you, you unlock a brand new character that mixes everything up again, and you can start practicing all your combinations and spell interactions from the start. Which is why I would say combat in Sea of Stars could be considered limited, but through this smart character progression style, it manages to keep it just entertaining enough before it would overstay its welcome. And just like the story, it keeps being simple, yet still fun. I would also like to touch difficulty a little bit, as I feel there is one major aspect of Sea of Stars that gets constantly ignored in reviews and people talking about it, and that's the difficulty and the relic system. Difficulty by default isn't overwhelming in Sea of Stars. As long as you understand the lock system and what your spells do, you will eventually figure out the game, and then it all depends on whether you're a fan of it or not. But I haven't found any huge challenge in the game or boss that gave me a particularly hard time. The whole game seems to be a steady, linear experience in almost all aspects of a game, from story to combat and difficulty. And even the side content isn't exactly side content, since you have to complete them all for a potential true ending of the game. So Sea of Stars truly makes use of every single mechanic in itself, quite literally, and connects them all together for one full linear experience. Instead, there are items in the game, the so-called Relics, which are customizable difficulty options you can enable or disable anytime, and if you ever feel like Sea of Stars is getting too easy or boring, I dare you to enable some of them and then evaluate the game, as some of them truly spice up the combat in ways that make Sea of Stars a completely new game even. For example, there is a relic that increases all damage taken by 40%, which while normally would seem simple, in a JRPG like this it affects all your strategizing since breaking logs becomes even more important, or delaying enemy attacks, and then even using your cooking and items to stay healthy. There's also an incredibly fun relic that reduces your health by 95%, but in exchange now your properly timed blocks will all reduce damage to just 1 so you don't instantly die, or your properly timed attacks will double their value for a quite skillful playthrough if you really want to challenge yourself and prefer a very interactive and grittier combat. Unfortunately, I found that most people who complained about boring combat never really tried these relics out to see how much they really changed the overall feel of Sea of Stars. Now on to world and exploration. Sea of Stars is a traditional linear game. You will be mostly traveling from A to B to go through the story, and even in zones, while the terrain itself and the map design is excellent, you're mostly going to go through hallways with treasures here and there you can pick up. But even when you finally unlock world traveling with your ship, you will quickly realize that there isn't much optional content available. You will be just traveling straight to where you need to go next and eventually visit every area. Like I mentioned earlier, there isn't even optional content in the game that much apart from the fun Wheels minigame, as almost every single side quest has to be completed in order to progress towards the true ending of the game, which after 100% completion I would say is a main part of the game and should be done by everyone. And at that point, yeah, you need to do everything the game has to offer, and secrets just become another requirement and part of the story to finish the game. But all of this isn't bad at all. A good linear game experience can be 1,000 times more fun than an empty, effortless open-world game as proven in recent years. And Sea of Stars is exactly that perfect linear experience that doesn't try to satisfy everyone and fail at it, but it sets out with its own goals and vision of what a retro-style JRPG is, and I would say fully accomplishes delivering that experience and helps the player experience everything it has to offer. Where I think Sea of Stars excels at when it comes to world and exploration is the fun and interactive ways it keeps every zone fun to explore, through the continuously evolving abilities you unlock to either push rocks and obstacles away or into the right position, control the time of the day, or other side mechanics that are dungeon specific like increasing or decreasing the water level. This combined with the absolutely free movement of being able to jump or climb anywhere, and the incredible modern pixel art just makes running around in this game pure joy. Every single dungeon in the game has a minigame like this that gave me Golden Sun or Zelda vibes, and I truly enjoyed them all. They never felt like a chore or something too easy or too difficult to handle, and were the perfect addition to keep the game fresh. And once again, it's another sign that Sabotage Studios is great at pacing their games through various tricks and added mechanics. Post-game that's another staple of JRPGs is also present in Sea of Stars, though in the form that I mentioned earlier as a requirement to the true ending of the game. And they're your typical extra bosses and secluded islands you have to visit on the world map that you were curious about since the very beginning of the game. And all in all, while not replicating the challenge and the same mystery as some more iconic older titles, it retains a similar excitement of visiting all these locations, even if it's for just lesser rewards. The game also tends to point out and help with almost everything eventually, and either by talking to all NPCs in a town or interacting with an object, there is no secret in the world that you have to find by yourself. But instead, if you play thoroughly and interact with everything and everyone, you will naturally find all of this content without having to look up anything online in guides. The way I feel in fact is that Sea of Stars somehow manages to capture the best parts of all retro JRPGs that we love and used to play on a surface nostalgic level, and then enhances them with its own modern design decisions and twists, and so offers a remarkable modern JRPG that while I think isn't perfect, it's an incredible achievement for the studio at a first attempt with the JRPG genre, and I can't wait to see what their next project will be. Finally, if I really want to quickly summarize my best and worst parts of Sea of Stars, I absolutely love the presentation of the game, the beautiful pixel art and the fantastic music that accompanies it. The world has a very interesting background story with fascinating legends and overall world building that is great at hooking you to it and wanting to know everything. and the main character interactions are also really wholesome and fun to recreate a nostalgic experience from your childhood, not necessarily just playing these older JRPGs, but also the emotions you used to feel when you were younger, which I personally always loved in all kinds of media. The combat of Sea of Stars also scratches the right spots for me as someone who likes both tactical games and turn-based JRPGs, and like I mentioned in the combat section, I think it's doing a great job at keeping itself fun and challenging for the whole game with the limitations it has, even though it isn't as deep as we would like. The parts I didn't like that much, one is definitely the lack of more story and character depth. Just like I love the world building and getting hooked to the world of Sea of Stars, I was totally disappointed by the loose ends and unexplained story threads by the end of it, and while it is an excellent simplified story, as someone who really cares about lore and story, I still have way too many questions unanswered. I could probably list more post-game content or a bit more secrets as something I wished for, but I also feel a lot of my criticism or negatives of Sea of Stars might just be limitations by development time or budget, since everything was so well done that I can't help but feel they were forced to make these cuts from an otherwise almost perfect game. So in essence, I loved everything about Sea of Stars. It's a fantastic game. I just feel there wasn't enough of it, and not in the sense of the usual "I just don't want it to end," but the literal meaning that it was just not enough for a truly full experience that holds it back from being a close to perfect game. Sea of Stars is definitely a JRPG I would recommend to the fans to experience, as even if it won't be your game of the year, it will put Sabotage Studio on your radar for hopefully further JRPGs in the future. I personally even hope for a prequel for Sea of Stars with all the happenings before this game, which I think could be an excellent story in itself. It's once again a remarkable achievement of bringing back a bunch of great elements of linear retro JRPGs, while also combining them with modern elements to separate the game from just being a nostalgic knockoff, and I think showed that there is still definitely a huge market for these types of games, despite mainstream media and companies trying to convince us of the opposite. But that is my 100% completion review of Sea of Stars, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure to play and review this game, and I hope you enjoyed this video if you're still listening. So if you don't mind, please also share us what you thought of Sea of Stars and what are the parts you really liked or disliked about the game. Thank you for watching, everyone. Like and subscribe and all that usual stuff, as it's greatly appreciated. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all the next time.